Good evening. If I could ask folks to take a seat. My name is Abby Land, and I'm the Mayor Pro Tem of the City of West Hollywood. And on behalf of our Mayor, Jeff Prang, and Council members John D'Amico, John Heilman, and John Duran, I want to welcome all of you here for a really important discussion this evening. The City of West Hollywood, as many of you know, has been a very strong advocate for gun control legislation from over 20 years ago when we supported our then Senator David Roberti, who was trying to ban assault weapons here in California, to the numerous times that Senator Feinstein has tried to ban assault weapons at the federal level, to our own city in 1996. We were the first to ban Saturday night specials, and 31 cities joined us, and it became state law. And we continue our advocacy around gun control legislation, supporting resolutions, and whatever we can be doing to make our city safer. So we were delighted when our new Congress member to us, but not to the United States Senate, Congress, Congress member Adam Schiff reached out to have this really important community dialogue with everything that has gone on. I think there is an opportunity if we can all work together and look at perhaps where is that middle ground that we can agree on so that we can move some legislation forward. And Congressmember Schiff has been an amazing advocate, and not only for West Hollywood, but for all of his district and also for all of America as he works so hard to see where can we agree and how can we move meaningful legislation. And so it is my pleasure, again, on behalf of myself and my colleagues and our community, to turn this over to our Congress member, and I will let him introduce the panelists and let us have a good community discussion. Congressmember Schiff.
Abby, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming this evening, and I want to begin by thanking the City of West Hollywood for letting us use this magnificent space, and I want to particularly thank the Mayor Pro Tem, Abby Land, for encouraging us to join here tonight. She has been a wonderful voice of reason in combating gun violence for many, many years, and it's only fitting that we meet here in West Hollywood, a city that has been among the most proactive in the nation in dealing with gun violence, and in particular, many, many years ago, attacking the problem of Saturday night specials. So we are proud to be in your city, Abby, and please thank Mayor Jeff Prang, who's not feeling well tonight, for being our host as well. We're really delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of our panelists as well as members of the audience, and we'll leave plenty of time for question and answer. But first, we're very lucky to have a distinguished and knowledgeable group of panelists, and I want to briefly introduce them, and then later I'll be asking each of them to make some introductory remarks based on their work and experience. Sheriff Lee Baca, we're very proud to have with us tonight. The sheriff has served LA County since 1999 as sheriff. He leads the largest sheriff's office in the nation, with nearly 18,000 sworn officers and employees. He brings to the office nearly 50 years of experience as a law enforcement officer, and we also want to extend our congratulations. Just last month, the National Sheriff's Association named Sheriff Baca National Sheriff of the Year. Congratulations, an honor that is well deserved. Senator Jack Scott, to my right, served from 2000 to 2008 in the California State Senate. He is one of my wonderful former colleagues from the legislature and an incredible, dedicated public servant. He also served in the State Assembly from 1996 to 2000. Before entering elected office, Jack had a long and distinguished career in higher education, including serving for 8 years as the president of Pasadena City College. He has also been our chancellor of the community college system here in California and done an extraordinary job. But he was a leading voice in the legislature on preventing gun violence for many years, following the tragic loss of his son, Adam, in an accidental shooting in 1993. He's the author of numerous successful gun safety measures in the California legislature, and one of the most dedicated public servants our state is lucky to have. Jack, thank you for being here. To my far left is Dr. Anand Pandya, an Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry and the Vice Chair of Clinical Affairs at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. He received his medical degree from NYU School of Medicine and completed his psychiatric training at Columbia University. He is an internationally recognized expert on disaster psychiatry and has received numerous awards for his work organizing volunteer psychiatric services following 9/11. Doctor, it's wonderful to have you here. Finally, to my far right, we're joined by Lauren Lieb. Lauren is a native of the San Fernando Valley. She has spent her 30-year professional career as an epidemiologist at the LA County Department of Public Health. She has a degree in health science from California State University Northridge and a master's in public health from UCLA. In 1999, Lauren's two sons were at the Jewish Community Center in Granada Hills when a white supremacist opened fire on a group of staff and children. Thankfully, no one at the community center was killed, but Lauren's son Joshua was struck by 2 bullets. We thank you for your advocacy, and we thank you for being here tonight. Finally, I want to note that we invited the National Rifle Association to provide a panelist to represent their position at the forum tonight, but they declined. And we did really want them to attend. I have to share a quick anecdote. When I was first elected to the state senate, in my campaign, guns had been an issue. And after I was elected, I was invited by one of the local chapters of the NRA to come speak to their members. And I accepted the invitation, and then they promptly withdrew it. They were not expecting me to accept, and I think they gave me a rather awkward explanation for the withdrawal of the invitation, saying they couldn't vouch for my safety in meeting with their members. In any event, my invitation to them was genuine, and we reached out not only to the local chapter but to the state chapter without success. But I'm confident we'll have members in the audience who can express the views of the association, if not of their leadership. Finding solutions for gun violence has been a priority of mine since taking office. I spent 6 years as a federal prosecutor here in Los Angeles, prosecuting gang members and violent criminals and seeing firsthand the way that guns can tear apart families and communities. At the same time, I grew up in a gun-owning household. I have fond memories of hunting with my father as a child, and I certainly understand the vast majority of gun owners are law-abiding and responsible. Guns are an emotional issue, and the proponents and opponents of gun violence legislation often talk past each other instead of acting with a spirit of openness and compromise. The mistrust and failure to communicate was brought home to me back in 2000 when I was first elected to Congress. That was an election that many of you may recall that a lot of people thought was decided, the presidential race between Gore and Bush was decided over the gun issue. And I was invited to speak on a panel, what was the nature of that issue in my race. And I remember expressing the view that in my LA suburban district, when people thought about guns, it wasn't so much about hunting or self-protection. It was more about gang violence, about drive-by shootings, about the shooting in Granada Hills and the shooting in Stockton. And when I was finished speaking, they asked one of my fellow Democratic panelists, a brilliant Rhodes Scholar from Oklahoma, Brad Carson, to talk about what was the nature of the gun issue in his Oklahoma district. And he said, well, in my Oklahoma district, it's also not so much about hunting or self-protection. It's about Lexington and Concord. It's about Lexington and Concord. And it was brought home to me, very graphically, what widely divergent views there are on this issue, even among Democrats, but certainly throughout the United States. So I understand the debate is difficult and fraught with distrust, yet when it seems like there's no hope for progress, I'm reminded of the words of President Obama at the memorial for the victims of the Newtown massacre, when he said, "Are we really prepared to say that we're powerless in the face of such carnage, that the politics are too hard? Are we prepared to say that such violence visited on our children year after year after year is somehow the price of our freedom?" And I think around the nation and in our community, millions of Americans are answering with a resounding no. The damage of Newtown is still fresh in our memories, but the horrific loss of 20 first graders and 6 dedicated staff to a gunman was not a unique event. Quite the opposite, as the panelists we have with us tonight can attest. The attention paid to gun violence has increased in the wake of high-profile shootings in Newtown, Aurora, Colorado, and Tucson, Arizona. But gun violence also tears apart families across America day after day in the form of murders, suicides, accidental shootings that often barely make the news at all. In response to Newtown, President Obama asked the Vice President to assemble a task force to recommend steps we could take. Those recommendations included a number of steps that could be taken by executive action, but the biggest reforms require congressional action. There are 3 proposals that are the centerpiece of the debate in Congress, and I want to just identify what those are so that they can be part of our discussion tonight. First, the President and others have proposed making background checks for gun sales universal. Here in California, we already require a background check for all gun sales, but many states only require a background check when you purchase from a federally licensed dealer, but not at a gun show or online. About 40% of all gun sales are made by private sellers, often at gun shows or through online transactions, and as a result, there's no background check performed. To give you an idea of the implications of the loophole for private sales, there are popular websites where you can buy a gun online. When you go to the home page, it gives you the option of whether you want to buy it from a federally licensed dealer and undergo a background check, or buy the same weapon from a private seller where no background check is necessary. This makes no sense, and I believe it's time that we close that loophole in federal law. Background checks help keep guns out of the hands of criminals and the seriously mentally ill. More than 2 million prohibited persons have been prevented from buying guns thanks to background checks, and that's just since 1998. Another aspect of universal background checks is improving the background check database so it's more complete and up to date. We run background checks on purchasers, but the checks are only as effective as the information states provide, and there are many states that aren't providing much information at all. For example, following the murder of 32 students at Virginia Tech by a mentally ill man who had been previously ordered by a court to receive mental health treatment, the state of Virginia began submitting mental health records to the database and has now submitted records for thousands of individuals with serious mental health issues. In contrast, there are still 10 states that have yet to submit a single mental health record to the background check system. That's not because there are no individuals who are seriously mental ill in those states. And I think we all need to commit ourselves to providing the right incentives for states to submit the records of people who are barred by law from buying a gun to the national background check system. Second, we need to update our woefully inadequate criminal laws to prevent guns from moving from the legal market into the black market where they end up in the hands of criminals. And there's legislation that I support to crack down on gun traffickers and straw purchasers with tough new penalties for prosecutors. More than a year ago, when this issue was not yet such a focus in Congress, I introduced a simple bill to increase penalties for straw purchasers who knowingly buy a gun on behalf of a person who is barred legally from owning a gun. I thought at the time it was the sort of common sense reform that could thread the needle, since there are few who don't at least claim that they're in favor of enforcement. Unfortunately, we got nowhere with the effort. And now there is new momentum behind an effort to increase penalties for straw purchasing and gun trafficking and finally create a criminal penalty specifically for gun trafficking. It's time that we give prosecutors those tools to go after gun traffickers and catch up with the seriousness of the damage that they can inflict. Finally, Senator Feinstein has led an effort to renew the assault weapon ban, which expired in 2004, that would prohibit the manufacture, importation, and sale of military-style weapons. It would also ban ammunition clips capable of accepting more than 10 rounds at a time. The legislation that the Senator has put forward would grandfather guns that are lawfully held before the ban goes into effect, so no one would have to turn over their gun if they legally own it before the ban. I agree with the Senator that military-style assault weapons are for the military and law enforcement. The Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms, but the Supreme Court has made clear that this right is subject to reasonable limitations, and just as there's no right to own a rocket launcher or a grenade thrower, we can rightfully draw the line at weapons with no purpose other than to kill a large number of people in a short amount of time. Separate from military-style weapons, I also believe prohibiting high-capacity magazines is a common-sense idea. As many have said, you don't need 30-round magazines to hunt or protect your home. I'm particularly struck by what happened in Tucson in 2011, where my friend and colleague Gabby Giffords was shot along with 18 others, 6 of whom died from their injuries. One of the dead was a 9-year-old girl named Christina Taylor Green, who came to meet Gabby because she wanted to learn more about public service. She was shot with the 13th bullet in the gun carried by the shooter. When he fired all 33 bullets in his weapon, he went to reload, at which point he was tackled by a bystander. Had his gun only held 10 bullets at the time, there's a good chance Christina would be alive today. All of these proposals have been approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and sometime later this month they'll be debated on the Senate floor. They're not the only proposals on the table. Many have rightly pointed out the central role of mental health in some of these mass shootings, since so many of the perpetrators of these mass shootings have serious mental illnesses that have gone undetected or untreated. So we'll be talking about that important issue with the panel as well. There are many other proposals in the Congress that deserve consideration. One other I'll mention that I introduced, called the Equal Access to Justice for Victims of Gun Violence Act, to reform a 2005 law passed by Congress that gives gun makers and sellers a unique and, in my view, undeserved immunity from civil liability when they act in a negligent fashion. As the mother of one of the children killed at Sandy Hook told me, immunity leads to impunity. Ultimately, good companies and good sellers don't need special protections, and the bad companies don't deserve it. There's no question, I think, that Americans want action. Polling data shows there's overwhelming support for reforms that can hopefully prevent tragedies like Newtown. 90% of Americans support requiring universal background checks the way we do in California. That includes 80% of Republicans and 80% of gun owners. That's an almost unheard of level of support. If we can't muster the political will to do something now, I wonder when we possibly can. So I look forward to the conversation tonight. I'm looking forward to learning about how together we can make a difference in combating the gun violence that we see all around our community and around our country. And now let me go to the very talented panel we have with us tonight, and first turn to our fabulous Sheriff, Lee Baca.
That we have a chance to have this dialogue. I have to reveal, however, there's been a series of historical points that need to be made. When our founding fathers created the Second Amendment of the Constitution, the only weapons that were in existence at the time were rifles and a pistol, and they were both limited to one shot apiece. We didn't envision when we founded this nation that we would be able to create machine guns and the things that are today the most lethal weapons in the world. So it was in the 1850s era when the Colt Manufacturing Company was able to come up with a revolver, and that led to the ability to shoot about 5 to 6 bullets within a single series of trigger pulls. So when you look at where we've come from the beginning of our nation's laws to the current generation of weapons, it's quite a spread of development where the lethality, particularly in the military weapons, is absolute. So I just put it in context because there has to be a distinction between domestic use and hunter's use and target shooting forms of weapon ownership vis-a-vis military weapons. And so that's the first effort that I believe has to be discussed. And I don't think it's unreasonable. There's like over 200 assault weapon types from different manufacturers, including some that manufacture more than one type of assault weapon. So we have probably as many as 500 different types of high-powered assault weapons that are in the military context, and then some of them have been domesticated as semi-automatics instead of automatics that the military has. So we have a whole lot of things on the table. And so the question then is, how many do we have nationwide? And we're dealing with over 300 million weapons that are circulating around the country in various states. So I think the first point is gun safety. You know, if we can just get the idea that these weapons are dangerous even in the best of hands. So we got to start there. No one wants to talk about the statistics of accidental gun deaths in the home. But I believe that Jack Scott will bring forth some information about that. So even those of us that have them, and I've been around guns a long time, that we need to be well aware that the safekeeping is safety point number one. I will confess, when I was in the Marine Corps, I was a member of the NRA. This was between 1965 and 1970, and I was on the rifle and pistol team. The NRA in those days totally was against assault weapons in domestic hands. However, the takeover of the NRA from General LeMay, who was a Korean War veteran and a Korean War general in charge of the Air Force, he became the chair of the NRA. Then there became this idea that the NRA was part of a marketing of weapons, where the military weapons of the world were being brought into America so that anyone who wanted to purchase these weapons could do so. So we started a whole different NRA era from that point up to the present day. The question then is, how many weapons do you really need to honor your personal safety needs? That really is the question. So we have kind of like the gold market theory with the gun market theory. A lot of weapons are just being sold back and forth and around, not for personal use, not for hunting use, not for anything that resembles home safety. It's for the fact that they're worth something. So my theory is to depopulate the gun numbers in America. We do the gun buyback program that some people kind of tease us about. But there are many, many Americans that have weapons. They don't even know what to do with them. They would like to just dispose of them safely, but they don't know where to do it. So the Sheriff's Department, the LAPD, and other police agencies are saying on a national level, why don't you set aside a certain amount of money and fund these buybacks, and you'll see where Americans will vote not with their voice, but they'll vote with their actions and turn these weapons in. And we shouldn't recycle them into the population. We should just destroy them, make rebar out of them like we do. The LAPD and the Sheriff's Department together, we seize 8,000 to 9,000 weapons just in our normal policing activity from gang members and from others who we come across who aren't legally entitled to hold on to these guns. And so we're at a place where we are destroying all those weapons as well. So there is a lot of challenges in this, but I just wanted to open those few comments and then move on.
Sheriff, thank you very much. Let me turn now to my colleague, Senator Jack Scott.
Well, first, Adam, I want to thank you for holding this forum tonight. I've had the privilege of working with Congressman Schiff for many years. We were elected to the same time to the state legislature, and we became fast friends, and I admire a great deal the kind of leadership he's given not only in the state of California but in the nation. So I was very pleased when I received a telephone call from him asking me to participate. In October 23, 1993, my wife and I, well, it was a Saturday morning, we had just gone out on a walk, and we came back and we got a knock at the door. And the most unfortunate news we ever received in our life was that one of the deputies of the Sheriff's Department told us that our son, Adam, our 27-year-old recent graduate of USC Law School, was killed. He had simply attended a party, and unfortunately the host of the party was a person who obviously was a gun aficionado. He had 4 guns in his home, and so he was displaying one of those guns, assuming, I guess, that it was unloaded, but it wasn't. And unfortunately, the gun went off and killed my son instantly. It's very difficult to recover from anything of that nature. In fact, my good friend, the rector of All Saints Church, came to me that very day. And I looked him in the eye and I said, "George, how will I ever get over this?" And he said, "You won't. But he said, you will limp, but you can go through life with a limp. And my wife and I also turned that into something in which we decided that we couldn't save Adam's life, but maybe we could save others. And so in 1996, I was elected to the California legislature. And I began to carry legislation, not taking away guns from people, but simply sensible gun safety laws. For instance, one that every gun in California would be sold with a trigger lock. Makes a lot of sense to avoid accidental shootings. Another one, which was sponsored by the chief of police that I was proud to carry, Senate Bill 491, it simply said that anyone who carried a concealed weapon without a permit could be tried for a felony as well as a misdemeanor. The choice could be in the hands of the prosecutor. Before that, it was only a misdemeanor. Now, that law has removed some very dangerous people from the streets of California. And so I continued my leadership on the gun issue. Yes, the NRA opposed me in elections, spent quite a bit of money on a few occasions to try to see that I wasn't elected, but fortunately, I continued to be elected. Something caught my eye not long ago. The Los Angeles Times said, America's poor health tops the charts. Well, it indicated that among the wealthy nations of the world, that we had some of the poorest health records in longevity, infant mortality, and in other things. But as I read the particular item, I came down here to this paragraph. Gun use emerged as a factor. Americans were 7 times more likely to die in a homicide and 20 times more likely to die in a shooting than their peers. Stop and think about that. Did you know that 30,000 Americans die every year as a result of gunfire? That's far more than the total of American soldiers that were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think if a plane went down every day with 82 people, we would do something about it. But 82 people die every day of gunfire in the United States. And we seem to be helpless about really taking any action about this matter. Once in a while, we read of those tragic events that catch our attention, like what happened in Newtown, Connecticut, where 20 children were killed. Their only crime was they reported for school that day. 6 adults who tried their best to stop this individual who, of course, later committed suicide. And we know many other incidents, but many other incidents aren't reported. It just happens day in and day out. And so I feel like that some way, somehow, we've got to do something about this. It's not only those that die. Many are injured. It's estimated that for every gun injury, it costs $14,000. There are over 200,000 injuries every year in the United States. That means over $2.8 billion that we're spending. So this is not a minor issue. There's nothing about those of us who speak up for gun safety and some form of gun control. We're not trying to take guns away from people. If you want to own a gun in your home, you can do so. The statistics are really not in your favor because you're 5 times more likely to have a suicide occur in your home if you have a gun there, and 3 times more likely to see a homicide there. But we're not trying to take the gun away from you. We're just wanting some sensible kinds of laws and rules, like background checks. We don't just give anybody the right to drive because we know they're behind the wheel, and that's a very dangerous kind of vehicle on some occasions. And yet we resist any attempt to say, even if you are mentally ill, or if you're someone who has been engaged, for instance, in violence in the home, so many wives die every year as a result of a violent husband who chooses to shoot her. And so we've got a problem, and we can face it. We can do something about it. We can stand up. We can talk to our state legislators. We can talk to, fortunately, our Congress members like Adam Schiff and others and say, we're not going to put up with this anymore. It's not even logical to think that one well-oiled and very highly funded lobby will stop us from saving all the lives that are taken. So, do I feel passionate about this? I certainly do. It has struck me personally. But I'm more struck by the fact that there are thousands every day, every year, that die in America as a result of the kind of gun culture that unfortunately we have chosen not to check.
Can you see why I was so proud to have him as my state senator? Let me now turn it over to Dr. Pandya.
Thank you. I want to start because I think I'm going to be the only person. Oh, sure. There you go. I'm going to start because I think I'm going to be the only person speaking critically about what's being proposed in the Congress at this point. I want to start by making my personal statement is that we need greater gun control. 61% of gun-related deaths are due to suicide, and as a person who's lost family members to suicide, I would like there to be fewer guns throughout this country. That being said, gun control without treatment for mental illness is a shame. It is an unjust and unsafe society that does not provide treatment for mental illness. And most people with serious mental illness are not violent, we know that. Most violent crimes are not committed by people with a history of mental illness, we know that. Do you know that most people with serious mental illness are more likely to be victims of violent crimes than perpetrators? Right now, the law says that all states are supposed to report into the National Instant Criminal Background Check System people who are, quote, committed to any mental institution or adjudicated as a mentally defective. Right? Remember, mentally defective is a noun. We don't talk about people who are mentally defective. We talk, you are a mentally defective. Aside from being outdated and offensive, that language is extremely vague and confusing. It's interpreted differently in different states. In some states, they do not differentiate between people who sign themselves voluntarily into a psychiatric treatment and people who are there involuntarily. You have to understand that psychiatric commitment, the criteria varies from state to state. In Los Angeles, if you're homeless and too confused to take care of a medical problem that you have, you've got diabetes and you've got an infection in your foot, and you're so psychotic that you can't quite figure out how to get care for that, you'll be involuntarily hospitalized. Now, I'm not arguing that that person needs a gun, but for those of you who've been medically ill and been in an ICU, if you've woken up out of whatever unconscious state and you were delirious, in most of the United States, if you woke up delirious, didn't know where you were, and were trying to pull out the IV from your arm, you would be placed on a psychiatric hold. And your right to hold a gun for the rest of your life would be taken away. And I'm not saying that that person should have a gun. I don't think anybody should have a gun. But as a psychiatrist who sees every day people with serious mental illness who don't want to get treatment because they don't want to be labeled as crazy, because they don't want their rights taken away, I'm worried about how this will deter treatment, how people who do have guns, who don't want to lose their guns, won't get help, and then will commit suicide. Since 2008, America has cut $4 billion from its already ailing public mental health system, and now we're cutting 5% more with sequestration. Now, while we're talking about why mentally ill having guns is a big problem, we're taking more treatment away from them. In many parts of this country, the states and counties have a plan for how people can get mental health treatment. There are counties in California where their plan starts with, when the person with mental illness gets arrested, they will, oh wait, you have to get arrested to get treatment? That's the way you get into the system? Why is it easier to get a gun than mental health care? I think there's things that can be done just by changing the language and getting rid of language about being mentally defective, just by making the mental health system work better, by investing and making it easier to get care. And thinking about laws that don't use mental illness as a proxy for getting guns out of dangerous hands. Let's look at the studies about who is violent. We know, we've done tons of studies about who's more likely to be violent. People with serious mental illness do have a slight increase in their risk of violence. And that's why I believe there needs to be greater gun control. But just to put that in perspective, men have a greater risk of being violent than women, and the increased risk by being male is far greater than the increased risk by being mentally ill. No one's talking about getting rid of the guns from all men's hands. And people with addictions. If there's a single risk factor that you want to take into account for who's likely to be violent, people with addictions and history of addictions, even after you are sober, have far higher rates of subsequent violence. In Los Angeles County, you can't get hospitalized involuntarily for having an addiction. This is not taking that whole population out. Being mentally ill and being civilly committed is not the same as being dangerous. And we are singling out not the people that we can most effectively reduce the violence by, but the people who are most likely to be the targets. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you for those very interesting comments. We look forward to exploring it more with you. Interestingly enough, and this has not been much of a subject of discussion in the whole gun control or gun safety debate, the same federal law that precludes those that have mental illness from possessing weapons also precludes those from who have a substance abuse problem from having weapons. And the degree to which those mental health records are not getting input into the system dwarfs in comparison to the degree to which those with substance abuse problems are not getting into the system. So that's a whole nother issue that we haven't really touched on, not only tonight, but as a nation. Let's turn now to Lauren Lieb. Lauren.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion today about reducing gun violence. An event 14 years ago brought me here today. I was at work when I received a phone call from my husband advising me that there was a gunman at the Jewish Community Center in Granada Hills where my 6- and 8-year-old boys were attending summer day camp. It was August 10th, 1999. Buford Furrow, a white supremacist and a neo-Nazi, loaded up his car with guns and ammunition and drove from Washington State to Los Angeles in search of Jews to kill. He walked into the Jewish Community Center with a semi-automatic weapon and started shooting. He fired about 70 rounds in a matter of seconds. He hit 5 people and terrorized scores of young children, mostly 5- and 6-year-olds, who were enjoying a day at summer camp. Little kids huddled in the classrooms as bullets flew by. Those who didn't have any place to hide were struck. A gravely injured 5-year-old boy barely clung to life. My 6-year-old son, Josh, after being shot twice, got up and ran for safety, even though one of the bullets broke a bone in his leg. An injured 16-year-old counselor played dead to avoid being shot again. The teenage counselors tried to protect the kids and bring them to a safe place. Everyone at the JCC survived, and the memories survived too. Many of the children suffered from severe emotional trauma, as did their family and friends, all of whom will never be able to forget what happened that day. Later that morning, Furrow shot and killed Joseph Aledo, a Filipino-American postal worker who was on his rounds delivering mail. Furrow asked Joseph to deliver a letter and then shot him 11 times. I've learned a lot since I received that phone call in August 1999. The shooting at the JCC was emblematic of much of what's wrong with our gun laws. I learned that it was easy for Buford Furrow, who belonged to hate groups, who had a history of violence and mental illness, it was easy for him to acquire weapons, including military-style assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines. He got them through straw purchases and at gun shows without background checks. Here are some of the other things that I've learned since that day. It's extremely easy for dangerous people to get their hands on guns because about 40% of the gun sales are legally conducted outside of the background check system. Although background checks have stopped almost 2 million people, prohibited persons from getting guns, there's nothing to stop a prohibited person from simply buying a gun without a background check at a gun show or from a private sale, not in California, but in many other states. At a recent police gun buyback in Tucson, protesters lined the streets and offered cash for guns that were being turned into the police department to be destroyed. Anyone standing there on the street, if they had the cash, could buy a gun from one of the people who had come to turn their weapon in for destruction. There was no background check, no questions asked, no nothing, cash for the gun, and out you go. That's just plain reckless. Opinion polls show that more than 90% of the American public supports background checks for every purchase, and that includes gun owners and NRA members also support background checks for every gun sale. In a lot of states, it's easier to buy a gun than it is to buy a bottle of Sudafed. I've also learned that the firearm industry is exempt from oversight by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So while there are safety standards for everyday products like cribs and teddy bears and sweatshirts, there are no safety requirements for firearms. If a toy poses a choking hazard for small children, it will be recalled immediately. However, there's no such oversight of firearms to ensure that they're well made and they operate safely. There's no requirement that they have an indicator to show that there's a round in the chamber to prevent accidental shootings. A $5 throwaway camera tells you if it's ready to shoot, but a gun doesn't. The firearm industry is the only industry with no agency responsible for ensuring the safety of its products. I learned that gun manufacturers flood the market with more guns than can legally be sold more guns than can be sold in the legal market, resulting in guns being diverted to the criminal market here and in Mexico. About 1% of the gun dealers in this country account for 60% of the weapons used in crime. The bad apple dealers should be shut down. But because of restrictions imposed on the ATF, only the gun manufacturers can control the flow of guns to these dealers, but they have no incentive to do so. In general, if individuals are harmed by a product, they can seek redress through the courts, but no action can be taken against the firearm industry as they've been granted immunity from prosecution. In 2005, at the behest of the gun industry, Congress passed a law that shields gun makers from being sued for harm caused by their products. Passage of the law immediately dismissed all current claims in state and federal courts and prohibited future claims. No other industry enjoys such protections. In spite of good research showing that guns in the home increase the risk of homicide, suicide, and accidental shootings, federal funding for firearm research has been restricted. Many elected officials in the gun lobby claim to support vigorous enforcement of the laws currently on the books, but behind the scenes they do everything they can to inhibit enforcement of the laws and insert barriers to enforcement. Then they circle back to point out the lack of enforcement without admitting that they orchestrated the failed enforcement. Since my son was shot in 1999, about 1.5 million Americans have been injured or killed by guns, and we've experienced repeated shootings in places that should be safe, like schools, temples, movie theaters, and shopping malls. Some places had armed guards that were powerless to stop the shooter. The mass shootings capture our attention and our hearts, but the equivalent of a Virginia Tech or a Sandy Hook shooting happens every single day in communities across the United States. For the past several decades, we've been conducting a dangerous natural experiment. To the detriment of millions, we have allowed the gun lobby to dictate our national gun policy, and it's been a failure. It's time for a comprehensive federal strategy to keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of dangerous people and to protect the rights of law-abiding citizens who want to be safe in their communities. We often hear that the proposed gun safety legislation, like background checks, would inconvenience law-abiding gun owners. What's more inconvenient than burying your loved one or suffering the lifelong consequences of an attack by a person who never should have been allowed to have a gun? Gun owners make up about 30% of the population. It's time to protect the rights of the other 70%. 220 million people. Can we prevent every crime with new laws? Of course not. But in no other situation do we just throw up our hands and give up and say there's nothing that we can do and that we should stop trying. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for your comments, and let me just pose a couple of questions, and then I'd love to go to our audience. Sheriff, can you put L.A. in perspective? How are we doing in respect to gun violence compared to other large cities and counties, and what do you think in terms of the kind of everyday gun violence we see, not the mass shootings, but the everyday gun violence? What, in your experience, has been the most effective in trying to combat that problem?
Well, as you know, Los Angeles County is a gang capital of America, and we do have violent gangs. And we've had record low statistics regarding the gang violence in the sheriff's area as well as the Los Angeles Police's area. But when you think about what happened in Sandy Hook or Virginia Tech or in Stockton or even the one in San Diego, we don't have mass killings in Los Angeles, but we have more killings in Los Angeles than we can tolerate because it's one person at a time or two at a time or maybe three at a time when these gangs get into their rivalries in a lethal way. So we're looking here at about 500 to 600 murders with weapons, guns being the principal one, and rifles, and some assault weapons. On an annual basis, that's been at a high at 2,000, but it's still too many weapons being involved in violence. And whether it's a mass shooting or one at a time, it's unacceptable. You know, we have to realize that there's some degree of recklessness going on here with the straw buyers that have been mentioned. There's another form of recklessness with no background checks. Now, we have that requirement in California, but the straw buyers are buying the weapons outside of California and bringing them in here. And they're getting in the hands of violent gang members. So there is a national problem here with the looseness in states, the non-existent regulations or non-existent safety plans. And California being the stronger state, as New York is, we're the ones that are having to deal with the fallout behind this. So the question then is, Americans are probably the most charitable people in the world. I mean, we are noted for democracy at its finest, and we're noted for diversity at its best, and we're noted for religious tolerance and all that. But somehow or another, we let guns run supreme. We're no longer a frontier country. We're a modern urban society. And I think those of us who understand the perils of accidental gun death, as Jack pointed out in his presentation, the perils of violent people who are in gangs along with violent people who may not be stable mentally, that those of us, and I think the statistic that was given by Lauren was a good one to hear, as to how many people really own all these guns, these 300 million guns. And I think she mentioned something like 30% of the population. Well, the other 70% of the population obviously doesn't have this fascination. And so then it becomes a matter of popular will. And I think that's where we're headed with this. And I think we'd like to see what kind of public initiative can happen to give the Congress members a little more strength in not being so timid about gun lobby and other things of that nature. I have a good relationship with the NRA in the sense of communication, but they don't like my stance on what I've been saying today. But you see, one of the reasons I think they didn't meet with you, because the NRA is not really like a club. You subscribe in the mail, you get your membership card, you have all the privileges of the membership, but they don't hold big meetings anywhere. So it's kind of like diffused. And the dues make them powerful, and the lobby makes them appear powerful. But you notice it's the same guy talking all the time. You know, and so there's not a lot of NRA people that are members jumping out there and saying, well, let me take the baton this day. And so there's almost an invisibleness about this that just threatens people through money, as you know. They will threaten to unseat a Congress member. They will use whatever leverage they can. But the truth is where are they in the day-to-day expressions of the issue? And I think those of us who want to see sensible managing of the gun issue, we're out there talking all the time. And so then the nature of the debate should be, where are those who are firm to the safety point? And I think the other statistic is that the sportsmen are on our side. And I think that they're the ones that are the most credible part of the argument with us. Okay, that's my point.
Dr. Pandya, let me follow up on your comments, because this is, I think, one of the most challenging parts of any comprehensive gun reform, and that is, what do we do with the issue of mental health? Now, obviously, as a threshold matter, I think we would all agree on your fundamental point, which is it should be far easier to get mental health service than it is to get a gun. And we've got a long, long ways to go in terms of making mental health care accessible and affordable and available to anyone who needs it. But under the current law, as offensive as the language is, there is a requirement that mental health records, certain individuals with serious mental health illnesses, be reported to the federal database, be denied access to a weapon. And you can certainly see in some of the more horrific shootings that there were people with serious mental illnesses. So two questions, I guess, is one is, how would you define that contingent of mentally ill people? How should we rewrite that statute to narrow in on those that pose the greatest risk and not stigmatize those with mental health problems? And as a practitioner, is there any way for you to identify when someone who's mentally ill may become violent? And now, we don't know much about the Sandy Hook shooter, but would there have been any way, even for his parent, to know that he was a danger to himself and others?
There are predictors of violence. They're all imperfect. There's no crystal ball, but we know that people are at increased risk when they engage in certain types of behaviors and when they have a certain kind of history. So statistically, we can tell who's at elevated risk, and we can, as a society, make a decision that but we're not going to tolerate above a certain degree of risk. If you're more likely to engage in violence, let's say X percent, we as a society can say, you need to either get rid of your guns or go into a hospital. But that is actually what we do every day in psychiatric emergency rooms across this country. So yes, it's not as unpredictable as some of us may fear, though it's far from a precise science. We can't say this person 100% will or will not do anything. To your point about what can we do, given that the law does need to identify some group at risk, California has legislation for psychiatric commitment that recognizes 3 categories. If you're a danger to yourself, a danger to others, or gravely disabled, you can be hospitalized. It is those people who are a danger to themselves or a danger to others that we do not want to have guns. The federal law does not talk about danger. They talk about being adjudicated mentally deficient or being committed to an institution. In many states, like in New York, they don't have a category of gravely disabled. So a lot of people, if you're like the homeless person I described earlier with diabetes and not able to take care of your medical problem, you would be hospitalized under being a danger to self. Not that you're trying to hurt yourself. You want to get help, but you are a little too disorganized to do so. The way that they would give you help is through an involuntary psychiatric hold. So changing the law to focus on dangerousness in mental illness, not just mental illness without dangerousness, is a change to the existing law. Also, there are no data systems of people with addictions in states that do not use addiction as a criteria for involuntary commitment. And so the federal legislation, I don't want to take the cynical position that, oh, it hasn't been implemented, so we shouldn't have the law. What we should be doing is implementing the law. But part of looking at how we got here after all these years, after having laws trying to get guns out of violent people's hands, is why haven't we helped the states to have systems with people with addictions in a system? Part of the answer is it would deter people from getting treatment. But at least you're focusing on diagnoses, addictions, that we know increase the risk of violence by a far greater margin than a person with depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder.
Thank you, Doctor. And Dr. Scott and Lauren, I wonder if you could comment for us on why this has been so difficult. You have both been advocates in this area for many years. I'm sure, Lauren, it's a particular frustration that very little has been done since the shooting at the Jewish Community Center. And Jack, you've encountered the difficulty in getting these bills passed in California, and that's magnified when we try to do it in Congress. Why is it so tough? Is it as some people speculate, the power of the NRA, or is it that that the public just doesn't feel sufficiently motivated on this, or where do you think the difficulty lies?
Well, I would say that California is much more open to this kind of strictures placed on gun ownership. And by the way, it's demonstrated by the fact that we have lower than the average gun deaths in California. We're the largest state in the union. You know, there's a myth out there that some way, somehow, that if we just had more guns, we'd have less crime. Well, sometime I point out the fact that if that were the case, America would be the safest place in the world, because we have 300 million guns in circulation. And the NRA, I think, once again demonstrated their folly when they suggested that in every classroom in America we have someone with a gun. You know, the increase of guns, in fact, if you look at the statistics state by state, the states that have the loosest views on guns, that is, that can say in effect anybody can carry a gun and conceal it, are the ones who lead the nation. And here's the list right here: Alaska, Louisiana, Wyoming, Arizona, Nevada, Mississippi. All of these states, they lead the nation in gun deaths, and they also have the less control. And just like Sheriff Baca said, one of our big problems in California is we have some very solid gun laws. We have a ban on assault weapons, for instance, a ban on ammunition clips, all of these things that we've passed in California, and they've made a difference. But state borders are porous. And so if you can go over to Nevada and Arizona and freely buy guns and carry guns and bring them across the border, then you can see how that's bad. And I don't know, the psychology here is a little difficult for me always to understand. some way or another, I think it is machismo, and I think it was pointed out well by the doctor at the end that men are much more prone to be violent. They're the ones who are in prison the most. They're the ones who do most of the shooting. We do have an occasional woman who maybe shoots, but I'm telling you, it's like 10% of compared to men. So there's something that's tied up with this psychology that I'm a tougher, braver man if I just have a gun to my side. And some way, somehow, if we could just change that idea and point out that idea of some way or another a weapon makes you a stronger, braver man, it just makes you a more dangerous human being to yourself and to others, is what all the statistics prove.
I'd like to add, before this situation happened with our son, and it was kind of thrown into this world that I had no knowledge of and frankly had no interest in, I was very unaware of what the laws were like, what the requirements were, and I have to think that many of the non-gun-owning public was like me, and you don't really know. You assume that there must be things in place to protect the public. And that's why I always, these things, I did all find out all of these things after our son was shot. The thing with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, that there was a special carve-out so that the firearm industry would not fall under the regulation of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So you can't buy a child's sweatshirt that has a drawstring around the neck because the child might choke. Your blinds have to have a special, the cord can't be a loop anymore because children choke on them. The teddy bear can't have button eyes because kids can choke on them. All these things, we go overboard. And the Consumer Product Safety Commission recalls thousands and thousands and thousands of products, not because someone was hurt, because there was the potential for an injury. So here we have these dangerous weapons that we know. In California did a good job of closing down some of the manufacturers that manufactured junk guns. We know that there are guns that lack safety features, that discharge if they are dropped, things like that. And there's nobody to enforce any safety requirements for those types of things. Other issues, just about background checks, and that it's really possible for somebody to just buy a gun without a background check. And you hear a lot of people say, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't. Oh, when I bought a gun, I had to have a background check. Well, that's because you bought it from a federally licensed firearm dealer. But you don't have to. In many states, you go to someone else through a private party, at a gun show, over the internet, and you don't have to have a background check. That's like saying in the airport that we could just leave it open. If you want to go through the security screening, go through. If you don't want to, the rest of you go around this way. If you don't want to take your shoes off and stand in the machine and all that, I've never once tried to light my underwear or my shoes on fire on a plane, but I have to do that. And so these arguments that it's inconvenient, these are law-abiding gun owners, why should they be inconvenienced? Well, I'm inconvenienced. Every time that I have to do all these things, we all do it, and we're all, the majority of us are law-abiding citizens. And so I just think if more people were really aware of the situation, they would be a lot more concerned about it, and that they'd be more active, they'd speak to their legislators, and they say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore.
Well, those are wonderful points. I think we've had two great airport analogies here tonight, the ability to go around the metal detector if you choose, and Jack's analogy that if a plane went down every week, and we lost that many Americans, we would do something about it. And we have at least that number that would be in the largest jumbo jet go down from gun violence every week in America. Well, let's now turn it open to our audience for any questions you may have. And yes, I don't know, do we have a traveling mic, or if you'll just... Oh, okay. The designated speaker, are you available to relate that question? Chow. I don't think you need a designated speaker, but we're going to let Chow ask your question. Chow, can you read that question for us?
What are the statistics of members of the gang members in LA County? Are they related to school education or school dropout?
Okay, the number.
In other words, are they dropouts or are they people in these gangs who are completing their school education or not? Maybe you don't know those statistics, but I would like to know if possible.
Okay, well, thank you. Those are very important points. Right now, pardon, repeat the question. Okay, the question is, how many gang members do we have? Are they in school? Are they dropouts? And what are some of the demographics? Both. School, they're in school and also dropouts. However, more importantly, the reason I said what I said is because we have 80 to 90,000 gang members in this county. Now, not all of them are violent. If you were going to get to the point where how many want to pack guns and go off and get into rival conflicts with guns blazing, it's probably in the 2 or 3% of the whole. The objective here in my comment is to say that murders, whether it's one at a time or in mass form, are the problem. That the violence factor is a health problem. It is a mental health problem. And I think that we didn't mention anything about violent games. The Sandy Hook shooter was an expert in video violent games. And he acclimated his brain in being able to do all this. That's why he was so effective in what he did. But he drove himself over the hill. What's interesting is his mother's the one that bought all the weapons. And she gave them to him to satisfy what might have been a mother's guilt. He was always in a conflict with her, and it was a battle between the two of them. She didn't seek any assistance for him, and then she gives him a lethal weapon, and then the first person he killed was her. It's an amazing story of a dysfunctional family that went awry because she was a good teacher, she was a strong person, and he was going off in a different direction, which the doctor would probably be able to associate with one form of mental illness. But that's what it's about. You see, young boys that turn into men and use violence as a way of proving their manhood by getting jumped into a gang through beatings is someone who's going to then step up to the next level with a gun. And it's really an aspect of what is the path to male violence. And the Center for Disease Control was looking to do a study on violence in America, and it got shut down by some of the members of Congress. So we have to ask ourselves, is our democracy working for us, or is it working to just reelect people who are afraid of being progressively intelligent on serious issues like public health and guns?
I've been instructed, because this is being televised, that we should use the microphone here at the podium. So anyone that would like to come to ask a question, why don't you come on and line up behind the podium?
Mr. Congressman, distinguished panel, my name is Lee Walkup. I'm the chair of the Senior Advisory Board for the City of West Hollywood. Before coming here this evening, I was on a conference call with Organizing for Action, the third iteration of OFA, originally organized by the President. And among the many things that are being done by various groups across the nation is an action by them this coming Saturday, the 13th of April. They're going to have a nationwide call out to individuals, groups, people, door knockers, all kinds of things to interest the public in this problem. And I think that's something we need to reach out to, is get ourselves interested in the problem. work with our organizations, work with our city, work with our sheriff, work with people that are aware and attuned and know what the problem is and how we as individuals and citizens can help and try to correct the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, Congressman and panel. My name is Yola Dore, West Hollywood. This question and/or suggestion would go to Dr. Jack Scott. By the way, I'm very impressed with your comments. You mentioned that 82 people die across this nation every day from gunfire. I'm wondering, with statistics like that, and everyone conveying an interest in not wishing to take guns that people use in their home to protect themselves, etc., away, why we don't invest in our public safety and PSA comments across the board in the media. We have some of our local media here tonight covering this fantastic town hall. And I think it's an ample opportunity, and it sends up good message to try to get this out there. What are we doing? And this is what's happening. I would like you to consider that as you put your bill forward in the Senate and in the House.
Thank you.
I think it's something that would bode well across the country.
Thank you. I think public safety announcements would be quite good. It is, unfortunately, because this issue has become so controversial that I think the media is almost frightened to say anything. There are some voices that, like Pierce Morgan and a few others who seem like they're quite willing to stick their neck out and say what they really consider. But, of course, immediately someone said that he ought to be deported as a result of his comments. So we just got to be willing to stick our neck out. That's the main thing. I mean, I remember when I first ran, I didn't know how my views on this issue would be taken, but I felt so strongly about them that I thought to myself, this is something I can't be silent on. And I found out, fortunately, that the people in my district, that there were more that appreciated my stand than there were those who did not appreciate my stand. Now, as I said, the NRA spent money to try to defeat me, and I had a few people who took me on in public debate, but I think you've got to go ahead and have the courage of your convictions to say what you think.
The fact is, they didn't beat you. And you're here tonight to be with us, and that's a testament to truth. Thank you.
Jack may have been present for one of the more memorable gun debates in the state assembly when I was in the state senate, in which the debate was over the assault weapons ban, the California ban, and Jackie Spear, now one of my colleagues in Congress, was advocating for the ban, and one of the other assembly members was arguing the other position, and took her to task and said, what do you know about an assault weapon? Have you ever fired an assault weapon? Well, as a former prosecutor, I once learned you don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. Jackie Spear was a congressional staff member in Guyana when Congressman Jones was shot and killed, and she was shot several times with an assault weapon. And her response to him was, I don't know what it's like to shoot an assault weapon, but I do know what it's like to be shot by one. And that was a pretty powerful testimony on the assembly floor. But I agree with Jack. I think PSAs on this, to make some of the points the sheriff alluded to and Dr. Pandya about, what's entailed with having a weapon in your home and how it's likely to be used, and as well as what safety steps should be taken to secure, to make safe for your family having a weapon in the house. I think all of those would be a very good idea. Sir. Oh, yes, Lauren.
I just wanted to add that there are a number of really excellent advocacy groups that people can join if this is a a subject that interests them and they want to work to promote sensible gun legislation. OFA was mentioned, and they're doing a lot of things now to try and advance the president's agenda on gun violence prevention measures. There are other national groups, the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, which has been around for a long time, started as Handgun Control Incorporated, and later after was changed the name after James Brady, Ronald Reagan's press secretary, who was shot in the head during an attempt on Ronald Reagan's life. So there's the Brady Campaign. There's some new groups. Moms Demand Action is a brand new group that has formed only since the shooting at Sandy Hook, and they have about 80,000 people signed up on their Facebook page now. And Gabby Giffords and Mark Kelly have started a national organization. There's Mayors Against Illegal Guns. There are a lot of really good avenues where if this is something that moves you and this is something that you think you want to try and help solve this problem, there's a lot of things you can do. And one of the things that they do have on all of these websites is really excellent educational material, facts, figures, statistics, you know, stuff to just really help you get up to speed and to have the tools to, you know, kind of discuss this intelligently with people who may have differing views, because you have to have a lot of information at your fingertips. But there are a lot of really good tools out there and ways for people to be involved if you're interested.
Let me just add one locally here that's been around for 20 plus years. It's Women Against Gun Violence. And it's based right here in Los Angeles and in West Los Angeles particularly.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is David Weisfeld. I helped to sponsor National Night Out for the last 26 years in our neighborhood and tried to contribute to this whole process. You know, tomorrow night they're going to have on NBC a show called Hannibal. There's a show called Walking Dead where they show people killing these human zombie types. They have a show now, Bates Motel, which is all about, you know, based on Psycho, which was a movie. There's a show, a first-person shooter game coming out this month called BioShock. It's a first-person shooter, very popular right now. So my question is, you know, when you have that kind of multimedia going on in this culture right now, you know, we're training our kids that this is okay. And, you know, the kids are training, you know, I've heard military people say that that's how they train their soldiers, using those first-person shooter type software simulating programs. I mean, that's crazy. And we're allowing that. And we're inculcating with our younger generation that somehow this is an acceptable mode of, you know, operating. It's crazy. That's my first thing. What to do about that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for raising that issue, and let me take a stab at it and then turn over to any of my colleagues who like to comment. We had, I sit on the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee of Appropriations, and we had a hearing on this very subject on a study that was done, I think, by the NSF that led to the conclusion that there was a relationship between violence in media and increasing violent tendencies among the viewers or the patrons of video games. The data that's out there, the analyses that have been done are conflicting on this subject. The witness who came to testify in support of the NSF report had done an earlier analysis, which I asked him about because I thought it was very interesting too. He led an earlier analysis that indicated that reading violent passages in the Bible tended to increase people's violent tendencies. And actually, I think the effect he found of reading violent passages in the Bible was stronger than the impact of violence in sort of our current medias and video games. I don't know whether either of those studies is accurate, but I do think we ought to have good data about this. And one of the things that the President has done is he's tasked the CDC to try to do good data on this and get some good research on it. And, you know, I'm very proud to represent, you know, probably more in the entertainment industry than any other member in the country. But that shouldn't prevent us from, you know, asking the questions and getting good data. And then we can decide what do we do with the data. And obviously, there are First Amendment considerations just as there are Second Amendment considerations, but without good information, then we're powerless to act. So I don't think we should be afraid to ask the questions. And I'll be happy to turn it over to my colleagues.
I'll say we know that when people have phobias, that showing them an image of the thing that they're afraid of when they're in a safe situation and they're not going to get hurt is a way to get them over that fear. We believe it works. We know it works. We've seen it work. So why that would not apply to violence, that we can calm ourselves down and become sort of immune to the heightened reaction to violence, it makes no sense. I think people waiting for that perfect study where you have a group of kids who are raised without any exposure to violence are going to be waiting for a very long time.
Just a quick question for Sheriff Lee Baca. My understanding is like up to 30% of the inmates in the jails are mentally having problems. And the question would be, do we have an effective mental health system that could address those people? They're known, violent offenders, and yet the question is what resources can be used for them in the correctional system?
Good point. I sadly have to report to you that national judicial decisions have basically opened up mental health hospital doors and have freed people who would best be served by being associated with the hospital, whether they come in periodically or stay there for long-term care. So we've poured them onto the streets of America. Right now, of our homeless population, about 30% have mental co-occurring disorders, and they're not getting much help because of their homeless status, although we have a large nonprofit base of organizations that do their best to keep the flood from continually flowing. So the most significant part of your point is that the Los Angeles County Jail is the largest mental hospital in America.
Exactly.
And the key is that I spend $20 million a year on psychotropic drugs, and we spend hundreds of millions of dollars with psychologists and psychiatrists and staff personnel from the Department of Mental Health. Jails are not the answer for mental illness, number one. Number two, the context of our conversation today, rarely do you find a person like this Sandy Hook person who his mother, ironically, also bought the violent video games for him, and he became so good at it that he got automatized by the process, and so that's why he was so effective when he decided to go over the top. And so the tragedies are detectable in the home, and so there has to be an education piece to all this, that all the families of America that have troubled youth that are growing up beyond the teens and getting into that adult period and they can't find anything productive in life, who have a lot of depression and various forms of anxiety, and then they use the sublimation tool with going into video games to build their self-esteem that they know how to do these games better than anybody else. This is all part of the process that we haven't really gotten deep enough into. More research has to be done. The truth is, we need the Center for Disease Control to be activated by Congress and give a real report to the American people as to what you're saying and what I'm saying, what we're all trying to say. We are the most intelligent nation on earth, but on this issue, we're dumber than dumb.
Hear, hear. Thank you.
If I may,
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to say, you treat patients with such severe illness in such adverse circumstances. I've had people who've come to my doors who've been under the sheriff's care, and if it's not a tragedy that they're taking up cells, it's a tragedy that your sheriffs are waiting in emergency rooms. You can't even get the patients into the emergency rooms. They have to wait for hours before the doctors can take them off your hands when they should be out doing the work of keeping our community safe because there's just not any room to take them.
Sir.
Rick Watts, member of the West Hollywood Disabilities Advisory Board. Senator Scott, your statistic about the cost of injuries totaling $2.8 billion per year, I would wager that if you factor in all of the other economic costs as far as lost productivity and so forth, that the true economic costs of gun violence, whether by assault weapons, handguns, or whatever, be they by criminal elements or suicides or acts of passion or what have you, would be many, many, many times that. Now, while Congress may not be able, between the two houses, to get its collective backbone in order, no offense because I know you're on our side, Congressman, to collect these statistics, I'm wondering if there is any problem with, as far as the Commerce Clause and separation of powers of individual states, particularly a state like California, where progressives have overwhelming control of the state legislature, to fund these studies on a state-by-state basis and then extrapolate them so they can at least be extrapolated to a national basis, as far as the costs of violence and the other statistics. And then also with respect to the law that gave immunity to the gun industry, I'm wondering if there's a problem, again due to the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, you're going to have to be the expert on that, of gun manufacturers, importers, and retailers, as well as individual sellers, being held financially responsible for their putting their products into the hands of people who commit these crimes that have such horrible costs. I do think Dr. Pandya has a very good point with respect to the wholesale labeling of persons with mental illness being labeled, as far as driving that part of the population away from seeking treatment by wanting to avoid being labeled. We saw this as now an almost 30-year survivor of HIV. We saw this with the HIV epidemic, and it made the epidemic much worse than it otherwise would have been. And particularly with respect to the point that he well makes, that persons with mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence than to be perpetrators of it. I think that should certainly be taken into consideration with whatever legislation can be gotten through both houses of Congress. And lastly, with respect to Sheriff Baca, the one gun that I am aware of, at least, that my family has ever owned, or the one handgun my dad had, was stolen. This has been their home down in Mississippi some years ago, and authorities down there, all they could do was simply, ask for whatever information he had on it, and don't know what happened to it, but it obviously ended up in bad hands. I am amazed that statistics like you cited, that in the years since the incident up at the community center, there have been 1.1 million people that have been injured or killed by gun violence. My God, that's twice the number of Americans who were killed in World War II. Surely Congress, with statistics like that, should be able to get its backbone together and do something substantive and stand up to the purveyors of these dangerous products.
Well, thank you. And let me just take on a piece of that, and I'll pass to Jack and the others that would like to comment. In terms of whether states can do anything about the immunity that the gun industry enjoys, there is a narrow window of opportunity there. As I mentioned earlier, I'm carrying a bill to repeal that immunity at the federal level, which would address not only their ability to act negligently with impunity, but would also address the point Lauren made, which is the inability of the Consumer Product Safety Commission and other regulatory bodies to oversee the industry in the same way they oversee every other industry. But if we're not able to get that done in Congress because of the dysfunction in Washington, there are some very narrow exceptions within that immunity when Congress passed this bill in 2005. And one of the narrow exceptions are when dealers or manufacturers act in a way that is in violation of law. There have been a number of cases that have tried to make use of those exceptions. Most have failed, but it looks to the underlying state law to see what does that state determine to be illegal. Now, if it's illegal to act in a negligent way, it is possible that a state can decide to be an exception to the immunity at the federal level. But unless state law can be drafted in such a way to take advantage of those exceptions, that federal law was intended to and has the effect of preempting state liability laws. And in fact, that's really what the law was specifically designed to do, because it was passed in the context of a number of municipalities trying to take action against the kind of flooding of their community of cheap handguns as a public nuisance. And none of those lawsuits had been successful, but as a way of making sure that they wouldn't be, the NRA was able to push this through Congress. Let me pass this on to my colleagues. We have two other people that we will take as our final two questions. We have a couple more, do we? Well, yes. Well, we have to be out in 10 minutes, so let's do this if we could. The remaining people that had their hands up, if you could each ask your question, we'll take all the questions now, and then in the last comments by our panelists, we'll try to respond to as many as possible. So if you could briefly state your question, please.
You were asking if there were any members of the NRA here. There are. My name is Lombard. I have been a citizen of Los Angeles 18 years now, 14 of the last here in the city of West Hollywood. You were asking for, perhaps I can give you the layman's response to some of the comments that have been made by this committee, if you would care, and because I'm concerned what your responses might be. I do have two questions, and I'd like to finish with those, but if it would serve you, I would gladly respond as a layman for the NRA, not in an official capacity, to the comments that you've made here tonight. Would that serve you?
It would. Unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes for you and the
Then
four
I'll
people
be quick.
behind you. Okay. If you can be quick, that would be wonderful.
Okay. Sheriff Baca, with regards to the comments that you made, the definitions in the 1960s of what an assault weapon was, when my dad kept an M14, was a weapon that had select fire. There are constitutional issues regarding access to these weapons that D.C. versus Heller addresses. I was wondering, you'll have to forgive me. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to give you the questions for expediency and just cut through it.
And we'd be happy to take, if you have any written statement that you would like.
I don't.
Okay.
I was hoping the guy was going to show up, and of course he didn't, right?
We'll take your questions instead.
But, because there's a lot here, but I'm just going to go with what I brought with originally before I came, okay, and make it simple. Congressmen, members of the committee, your enemies are my enemies. There are 450 street gangs in the city of Los Angeles that operate, whose numbers approach 45,000 people. If there are any here this evening, I invite them to come up and say how they feel about what's going on at the federal, state, and local levels. I'd be interested in their opinion, but I doubt they're here. Sheriff, when your deputies respond to a situation, they're showing up with semi-automatic pistols that carry magazines that have at least 10 rounds in them. They have patrol rifles that carry magazines that have at least 10-round magazines. They're responding to a threat that I'm probably already in the midst of 10 minutes already. And I don't see why there are individuals that wanted. If this is what sheriffs are showing up with to counter the threat that I'm facing, why are there restrictions being imposed for ordinary citizens to go and have those weapons in the first place, if that's what I'm going to face in the end? In the state of California, we can keep arms, but we really can't bear them. As of 2013, no open carry of long rifles or handguns. Sheriff Baca, you know, it's, I don't know what the proper term is here, but
please, let's let the gentleman finish.
Okay. Congressman and Sheriff, I just direct these comments to you. In O'Scallion's opinion in D.C. versus Heller, the ruling protected the constitutional, the protections the Constitution affords a right is not determined by the value of our times. Otherwise, there would be little benefit to the written statement of them. This decision restricts the power of local and state governments to interfere with the individual right to have guns for personal use. How do you reconcile what's going on in the federal levels and the state and local levels with this most recent decision?
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
No, thank you. We appreciate your participation tonight. Sam.
Hi, my name is Sam Hutman. I'm here as a representative of Ikar Synagogue. We're not located in West Hollywood, but we have a lot of members here, and we have a committee working as best we can to represent people who care that our children are safe and that our communities are safe from gun violence. Lauren and Senator Scott, I was so sorry to hear your stories, and Dr. Pandya, I'm so grateful that you're a part of this conversation, because I think that mental health piece has been a lighter voice in a lot of the rallies and the conversations I've seen, and I would encourage all of you to make sure every time there's a gathering that there is a representative from the mental health field, because I think it's such a critical piece that there's a lot of mystery around. And even though I have 1,000 questions and there aren't time, I guess sort of I had one comment. I'm very disappointed in my citizenry that the room isn't full. And I was sitting there thinking, and then I kind of got that glass half empty, half full, and I thought, well, at least it's half full. And so, thank you to everybody who took the time to show up. I wish the room was busting at the seams, and you guys all showed up, and I thank you for that. But as a citizen, sort of with a concern and a group of about 500 members from our synagogue, to a triage question. I mean, there's so many things that came up tonight that it's just boggles the mind. Like the study that you said was canceled. I mean, I just wanted to cry about 10 times during the evening. From a triage point of view, with your expertise and all the thought you've given it, can you direct people who might be new to this conversation with the top 3 things an ordinary citizen who cares deeply about this could do?
Thank you, Sam. Yes.
Good evening, Stephanie Harker. I'm a resident of the city of West Hollywood. Thank you for being here. I'm wondering, and yet it's another airport reference, if there isn't something we could do, particularly in the schools immediately, that would not offend the constitutional purists, and that is metal detectors in the schools. We have them at every airport. We all go through them. We have them in the courthouses here in Los Angeles. It seems to me it would be something that would protect the most vulnerable of us, and I don't think it would be that vastly expensive, and I don't think that, again, that it would offend anyone or would be intruding on the Constitution. Thank you. That's my question, please. If we could bring that part of it into it, it seems it could be done rather quickly to get those into the schools, particularly in gang areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Juliana Serrano. I'm with All Saints Church in Pasadena. It's good to see you, Scott. We're very proud of the fact that we have a gun buyback happening in our own community on May 11th, and I'm very pleased that our mayor has signed on to the Mayor Against Illegal Guns campaign. My question is a simple one. It's a brief one. You've talked about the many facets that impact gun violence, but you have not talked about race. Race is a factor in who is most likely to be impacted by gun violence. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for 18 to 24-year-old African American men. And so my question to you is, what role does race play, and how do we address it in terms of gun violence and legislation, community programs, so forth?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jeff Luswood. I'm an attorney in Hollywood. Congressman, has Congress ever addressed the fact that most of the school shooters were on psychiatric medication at the time? And I have a couple copies of a flyer that I would like to give you, if I can give that to you now. Can I give this to you?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for all the questions, and I'm going to just start with Dr. Pandya, and we'll move through the panel, and please feel free to jump into any of those questions. We have just a couple minutes remaining, and then we'll wrap up.
Excuse me, Congressman?
Yes.
I could not stand in line because I have back injury.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Very quickly, Senator, our heart goes out to you. My condolences for your loss. Ms. Lieb, the same for the horror that you went through. What I didn't hear tonight was education about guns. I don't think that half the people in this room know what a gun is or what it does or how to use it safely. People have to be educated on gun safety. Senator, your son died because of gross negligence of the gun owner. Pure and simple. That has to be taken care of. If we have the responsibility of gun ownership, then we have to handle it safely and responsibly and ethically and lawfully. However, let me say this. Excuse me. If you were to wave a magic wand and do away with the Second Amendment and take all the guns away from honest citizens in this country, don't think for a moment that all the criminals wouldn't have them. Sheriff Baca, you know that as a fact. As far as magazine capacity is concerned, I reject legislators legislating the capacity of magazine capacities on how many rounds they can hold. Simple reason. Sheriff Baca knows that when a law officer goes out in the pistol range and shoots at a stationary target, they can shoot with great accuracy. But when the targets are shooting back at them, their accuracy and proficiency falls greatly, and they will use a lot of ammunition before they can end the confrontation. So I hope that people who have the authority to legislate and make these laws that you're contemplating on doing will educate yourselves on all aspects about the consequences of what you are doing. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pandya, why don't we start with you, and we'll quickly wrap up.
I'm not familiar with that study that he referred to about most school shooters being on psychotropic medications. I know that that's not the case in Newtown, and I'd be glad to look at that study. Thank you.
Just want to thank all of you for being here, and thank you for all the very appropriate and intelligent questions you've asked. Thank you.
Well, I would, number one, say that I did author a bill that was signed into law that said when a gun was sold, that there had to be instructions given to the person who purchased the gun. I absolutely believe in the training of individuals who purchase a gun, just as I don't believe that we ought to let people get behind the wheel of a car without some kind of training. And if I use the illustration of a car, I will point out to you that in 1960, we were so horrified by car accidents and the toll that was taken that we reduced them by 50% because we were willing to begin to pass laws that said there would be seat belts in cars and that there would be speed limits that were reasonable, and we made our cars safer with all the interior of the car. We could do the same thing if we would put our minds to this matter of guns. We wouldn't stop gun deaths and gun injuries, but we could do a lot, and certainly I would be very much in favor of better training for anyone who chose to buy a gun, because very frequently someone who owns a gun uses it in a careless manner.
Along those lines, I mean, I think that helps to highlight the need for national policies, because I believe it's in Virginia, I don't remember exactly which state, you can get a permit for to carry a concealed weapon on the internet. So you fill out the form and get the permit. You don't ever have to have handled a gun in order to have that. So our system is way too open and lax, allowing people to own and handle and carry weapons who have never received any type of training. So I absolutely agree there needs to be training. That's the responsibility of the gun owner to do that. The Heller decision, yes, they affirmed that there is an individual right to own a firearm, but they did also, as with other rights, it's not without restriction. So you can't, it's not any weapon, any time. They did agree that there can be reasonable restrictions on what type of weapons and where you can carry them. Top 3 things, I actually have some information here that I could provide to you. That if this is something that interests you, start making phone calls to legislators and tell them your opinion, because they need to hear from the public and know that there is public support for these measures. That's one thing of the top 3.
Let me just briefly conclude and address a couple of the points that were raised by the last questions. And I concur completely with Lauren in terms of the Heller decision. It did confirm an individual right. Prior to that decision, there was a constitutional question about whether what the Second Amendment protected was the right to a well-armed militia, or it actually protected an individual right, and the Supreme Court resolved that in favor of an individual right. But the Court also made it clear that it did not prohibit reasonable regulation of the right to bear arms. And this is not unique to the Second Amendment. The First Amendment is also subject to regulation. In commercial speech, for example, is very heavily regulated. That's why we can have truth in advertising laws. You can also impose limitations. You can't call out fire in a crowded theater is one of the most widely cited exceptions to the First Amendment that would otherwise seem absolute in its character. So there are a great many exceptions, as demonstrated by our libel laws and slander laws. The same is true of the Second Amendment. Indeed, the same is true of every amendment. They're not absolutist in character. So the question, I think is within the Second Amendment confines, what can we do that would be productive? And obviously, there's no bright line here. As the doctor was mentioning in terms of mental illness, there is no bright line that we can draw that says that this category of people are so much more likely to commit a violent act that it's quite clear this is where the line should be drawn. But as Dr. Pandya mentioned, there are good facts, there is good data that has a predictive value that we can use and should use to improve the safety of the community. Well, the same is true in terms of the nature of the firearm itself. We don't allow people to have fully automatic weapons. Now, you could say that when someone is under duress, they're the subject of an in-home invasion robbery, they're not going to shoot very accurately. Even if they're a deputy sheriff, they're not going to shoot very accurately. All your deputies would, but in other counties that may be the case. And so a fully automatic weapon in the hands of that homeowner would be of great value, and that probably there is some truth to that. But the risk to the general public is so much greater than the added value that that homeowner would get, that it makes sense that we don't allow people to have fully automatic weapons. I think it would also make sense not to allow the civilian population to have assault weapons or extended ammunition clips. And yes, you can argue that there would be a marginal added value to a homeowner having an extended clip. But unfortunately, there's a much greater added value to someone going into an elementary school who wants to kill as many people as possible. And to me, that's a common sense measure that we can take consistent with Heller and consistent with a respect for the Second Amendment. But we all appreciate your feedback tonight, and if you would join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, and I want to give a particular shout out to our sheriff. All of our panelists are busy people, but our sheriff has an entire county to serve, and for him to spend a couple hours of his time with us tonight is a great compliment to all of us, and we thank you, Sheriff. Thank you all for attending. Abby Land, thank you, and the City of West Hollywood. You're wonderful. We appreciate it, and I hope you all have a good night.
Great to see you.